And now, please welcome Christy MacLear.
Is Ingrid coming? Great. Before we begin with a wonderful panel we have here, we are going to show the results of the question regarding the effectiveness of the landmarks law. And yes, the law is working 7%, yes, but it needs to be updated, is now just updated at 57. No, it doesn't go far enough, 23. No, too many buildings are already landmarks. So this is a great tie-in. This is actually real time. I'm just going to introduce my speakers one by one. If you don't mind, I'm going to introduce by question. And it really relates to sort of what you all are saying about the landmark law, which is it may need some updating. It's very effective. But let's just talk first about, I wanted to set up two questions, which is about the effectiveness or what we have now. And Cade Benfield, who was with the NRDC for 33 years and now works in Washington, D.C. with PlaceMakers and a senior counsel for environmental strategies. So my question for you is about how landmarks positively affect the preservation of cities and local neighborhoods. So if you can just talk about its effectiveness in that process.
Yeah, and well, first of all, thanks, Christy, and thanks everyone for having us. Out of the many reasons I could talk about why this issue is important, I'm going to select two. And the first is something that I call cultural stability. We've all had the experience of walking down a street or perhaps a landscape and seeing something drastically altered, and it's very disoriented. We lose our bearings. And I've had the experience of forgetting what was there, even as little as a week later. Opposite of that, when we have cultural stability, is calming and reassuring. When we save the best of our older built environment fabric, and it becomes sort of what knits our commons together. It brings us together across generations, it brings us together across sectors. The other reason I think it's so important is because of environmental sustainability. When we are able to recycle our older properties, we conserve material resources, we reduce pollution, we save carbon emissions and other pollutants. And I could go on, but I'm going to stop there in the interest of time.
Our next panelist is Ingrid Gould Ellen. She's a faculty director for NYU. And the Paulette Goddard Professor of Urban Planning and Policy for NYU. And I just wanted to ask you a question, sort of also to underscore the impact on the city. And for some people, preservation has a negative effect, either from a cost basis or it impedes development. So I just wanted to get your input on that particular aspect.
So, I mean, I think that establishing districts, historic districts in high demand cities probably does increase prices to some degree through restricting supply, through making it more expensive to redevelop, through potentially limiting the amount of residential space. But, that said, historic preservation is surely not the primary factor driving the high prices and rents that we were just talking about with the borough president. Historic districts, first of all, historic districts, at least in New York City, tend to be as high, as densely developed as comparable neighborhoods surrounding them. And I think, the fundamental reason we see such rapidly rising prices and rents in New York City is simply the fact that we have very limited land in the city, and a whole lot of people want to live here. And that's, it's not about historic preservation. And I think it's also important to say that historic districts also deliver benefits that can offset those costs of restricting supply. Indeed, a key reason in the work that we've done at the Furman Center, a key reason that we find that that prices tend to be higher in historic districts as compared to, comparable properties, the prices of comparable properties outside those districts, is because the districts themselves make those neighborhoods more attractive to prospective owners who value the certainty that those districts provide. And that's not even valuing, right, there are obviously a whole lot of very difficult to quantify benefits that, Kate talked about some of them that historic districts provide in terms of, preserving our architectural heritage and, ensuring that we have some continuity to the past as well.
Our third panelist is the Bronx Borough President. Thank you, Honorable Ruben Diaz Jr., for being with us today.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
And I think in your borough, there are a number of examples of what we're talking about here. And I think it also will introduce some of the key ideas about what does the next 50 years for preservation need to be, specifically around some of the key projects that you have going on in the Bronx. So if you could just talk about what are the things that you're seeing preservation being important in those projects.
So preservation is absolutely important, and it's worked for us in the Bronx. A lot of folks, many of you perhaps haven't been to my borough in quite some time. Some folks still have this negative perception or negative images of the Bronx, but we've totally benefited from preserving not only neighborhoods, but particular buildings and structures. We've really turned it around. And just to piggyback of what was said earlier, this is a way for us to get people to be nostalgic about the Bronx again, get intergenerations speaking about a particular building, and creating jobs, creating and stimulating the local economy. What do I mean by that? When you look at the Kingsbridge National Ice Center, or the Kingsbridge Armory, which is going to be the largest ice sportsplex, not just in New York State, but in the entire United States. We were able to preserve that building, beautiful, majestic building, but at the same time, we're going to create jobs there, and we're going to make it a place where folks from all over the city or the tri-state area and beyond can come and welcome them back to our borough. If you look at the General Post Office, the General Post Office is also being preserved and is landmarked. The federal government has been divesting themselves, or the postal services have been divesting themselves of property. We're going to have a huge market there, like the Chelsea Market, which is going to be an added amenity to how we've rezoned the southern part of the Grand Concourse, or the waterfront, between 149th Street and 138th Street along the Harlem River. If you, for instance, look at Orchard Beach, the pavilion in Orchard Beach, one of the ways where we're able to convince the community and public officials that preservation is a good thing is by playing on the fact that, first of all, aesthetically, it doesn't look as good as it should. But secondly, letting them know that if you do something with this structure, like the two I just mentioned, but also the pavilion, that you could do it in a way where you get a good rate of return on your investment. I don't think that people are necessarily opposed to preservation. The moment that you have to try to convince people that it's the right thing to do, it's all predicated on how much of the public dollar or dollars you're saying that you want to spend on it in terms of restoring it and renovating it. And if you do so in a way where you convince the public, where you convince the elected officials and public officials that you get a good rate of return on your investment by creating jobs, making it a destination point, having more tourism come in, that is good locally. That will be good for that site, but it's also good for the Bronx and therefore the city of New York.
Well, what's interesting is if you look at TWA, which came before us, public-private partnership, and if you look at some of the things in your borough, which are an armory, a bridge, a post office, a number of these are large-scale, the courthouse, things that are happening that, could be an enormous demolition site and turn into something commercial, but you've really, it takes a public-private partnership in order to look at what the use is to engage the people that the armory could have been. What was it intended to be before the ice rink? It was going to be a shopping
an
mall.
indoor mall.
Right. Right.
That's what they wanted to do.
Consumer culture, not exactly the best use for that.
Well, not for that location, and that's why we opposed it. And many of you probably read about that, where we fought the city back and we fought the developer back. We thought that it would hurt the local merchants in the area. We thought it would hurt Fordham Row, which is one of the top 3 shopping strips in New York City, which is only a train station away. And we also knew that we were going to get an indoor shopping mall, a brand new one, in the east side of the Bronx, Bay Plaza, which today employs 1,900 people.
Yeah. I want to ask you about, so we have one of the oldest landmark laws in the country. Is this still an effective tool? What do each of you think? Or are there better ways that we can use preservation as part of the planning process?
As someone who's the non-New Yorker, I'm going to defer to my colleagues on that one, but I am going to take the opportunity to follow up on some of the very good things that Ingrid and Ruben said. I work nationally, and what we're seeing nationally, and it's playing out in the Bronx, is this great resurgence of interest in cities and in older neighborhoods that were once given up for dead.
Yep.
I mean, now the problem is that they're too pricey. The old problem was that nobody wanted to live there because they were disinvested. So in a sense, this is a nice problem to have. It's a challenge, and it's one that we have to figure out, but it's a sign of progress, I think.
Just to answer your question, if
Go ahead.
The laws in the city of New York, I think, are effective, and for us in the Bronx, we're last in all of the development that's happening in New York City, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because we were able to learn all of the things that worked well in other boroughs.
That's right.
And also stay away from the things that could have been done better, or at least do the best that we can. And one of the pluses about the Bronx is that sense of history, that culture. There's certain neighborhoods, certain buildings, certain things that whenever you ask somebody who's from the Bronx, that's the first thing they bring up. And it's worked well for us. And so the only thing that I would change is maybe we have to sort of streamline the way we do landmarking. I say that because there's quite often a lot of delay. And perhaps what we should do is we should look into maybe doing it in a way that we do the ULURP process. And if something's going to get preserved and landmarked, then so be it. But we should do it faster, because I think the delay creates an adverse effect, or it hurts on both sides, both faces, both sides of the coin here. When you delay it, I think it gives you a less and less of a chance for the preservation to take place. And at the same time, it delays development. So I think that one of the things that we should do is maybe have a way of maybe streamlining the process.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I think that, there's always ways that you can tweak things to make them better. And certainly, our public officials, I know you work hard to do this, you should always be looking. We should always be thinking about ways we can do things better. And I think, one thing I think, actually, I will really give a lot of credit to the de Blasio administration. I really think that they are trying to weave the landmarks preservation process and the commission and those decisions into the sort of the larger conversation about planning. And we were talking again backstage about the importance of integrating all the different investments that are being made. Well, preservation needs to be at the table too, and we need to really think hard. Okay, maybe there are going to be some impacts on housing, and we need to think about that. Maybe we want to upzone somewhere else if we're protecting a really vital neighborhood. I think that, I think there are ways to streamline in terms of introducing guidelines and maybe thinking about kind of more staff level review rather than going to the full commission that could speed things up. And I think finally, this is more sort of an out of the box idea, but, think about whether there's sort of more incentives that, incentive-based ways that we can promote preservation. So rather than simply relying on regulatory tools, well, what if we say, okay, you preserve this facade and you get a density bonus?
Right.
There might be different things we could experiment with there. I'd love to see some of that in the next 50 years.
Thus said from a true economist. Very well. But
I'm not even an economist, but I play one on TV.
The idea of a system approach versus a building by building approach, I think,
Yeah.
is sort of a consistent theme, we think. And I think even in the Bronx, we're looking at, one of the big victories is some major transportation that's going to be happening in your borough, right?
Right. So we were so ecstatic when there was an agreement reached about a week and a half ago between the city and the state to fully finance this 5-year MTA Capital Plan. And the reason being is because there's $750 million in this plan with an additional $250 million by the governor that would be allocated to do 4 Metro North stations in the eastern corridor of the Bronx. And you all know, in the history of this country, the rails and rail stations are totally transformative to villages, towns, counties, municipalities. So that is going to be huge for us because in the eastern corridor of the Bronx, we really need to build that transportation infrastructure. We're looking forward to examining and studying 3 out of the 4 stations. One will be in Co-op City, which already has high density. The other one in Morris Park, Hunts Point, and Parkchester/Van Ness. Leaving aside Co-op City, we're going to look to see how we rezone the other 3 so that we can have some density, but it's going to help to create jobs, preserve jobs, and for folks in that part of the Bronx, many of them take upwards of an hour and a half to almost 2 hours to get into Midtown, taking 2 and 3 forms of transportation. They can now get to Midtown. They would be able to get to Midtown in under half an hour, or so many people go north to Connecticut. You can get up to Connecticut in under 45 minutes. So that, I believe, is probably going to be the biggest thing, aside from all of the things that we've been able to accomplish in my borough in the last 6 years alone. That is going to be the greatest victory for us.
Yeah, and I think it's all a part of this whole planning concept, the economic viability, how it doesn't push people out necessarily, but it creates vibrant neighborhoods. So we only have a couple of more minutes, and I wanted to ask a final question. What would you consider, what are some new approaches to preservation, and how do we engage younger people to continue to create ownership across, all levels and ages of people? What are your ideas on that?
I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be thinking about older communities and neighborhoods. The history of preservation in this country has been one of landmarking and a focus on architecture, but I think where we're moving is a focus on neighborhoods and communities and how those communities are going to adapt to changing circumstances in the 21st century as we bring green infrastructure into our communities. How is that going to work in older communities? As we have neighborhood-based energy systems, as we have new forms of transportation, including driverless vehicles, in historic neighborhoods with their skinny streets and high pedestrian activity. How's that going to work? How are food systems going to work, when they are based in the neighborhood? I think these challenges are incredibly exciting.
Yeah.
So for us in the Bronx, for instance, we should start taking into consideration, and I think that the salient word here is history, not just the architectural history, but also history in and of itself. 1520 Sedgwick Avenue is an address you should know in the Bronx. The Bronx is the birthplace of hip hop. So you want to get young people, let's take hip hop for instance. This is where DJ Kool Herc and his sister, they used to have these jams out in the community center and they used to bring their systems downstairs until finally the landlord thought they were making too much noise and kicked them out to Cedar Park. But this is where hip hop was born. And the building itself, structurally and aesthetically, it leaves a lot to be desired. It's not an architectural marvel, right? But the history of that building is something that I think could drive folks not only to that actual site, but to the Bronx and to that community.
That's great.
Yeah, and I'd say, I mean, I actually think young people already think that these historic neighborhoods are cool and hip. I don't think that's the issue, actually. What I would say is that in the same way that I would you're calling for the preservation community to sort of embrace history and not just architectural history, I would say I'd like to see the preservation community pay attention not only to architectural fabric and architectural diversity, but also social and economic fabric and diversity. And that's something that we also want to preserve in our neighborhoods, certainly in the Bronx, but certainly throughout New York City.
Yeah, that's great. So the rave will be, what's the address again?
1520 Sedgwick.
Okay, so we'll all meet you in the Bronx there. And I want to thank you so much for coming out. Thank you very much.
Thank you.